I'm just going to grab this photo and I'm going to head into my edit module. And the reason I'm grabbing this photo is because it's really underexposed. And I actually shot it underexposed because I wanted to maintain all of the details in my window here. Well, I shot it raw. And if you are going to shoot a photo of an interior and you don't want the windows to be blown out and you only want to shoot one single image and you want to modify it, shoot raw, because it'll give you all of that raw data in these shadow areas so that you can quickly pull them up without actually adding in a bunch of noise that you need to get rid of later. So over here inside ON1 Photo Raw is our tone and color, and since I was shooting raw, I'm going to have this little camera profile, and this is going to allow me to choose a different camera profile for this photo. I'm actually going to go down and I'm going to choose ON1 Neutral. And the reason I'm choosing neutral is because it kind of gives it just a neutral look. You know, it's a little bit flat, there's not too many harsh shadows, there's not a lot of contrast. It's kind of just a neutral, flat looking photo. And because it's raw, it gives me all of that raw, all of the raw power in the photo that I can modify to pull out all the mid-tone shadows and some of the blacks without actually pulling out and blowing out these windows. So now that I've switched my camera profile to neutral, I obviously want to bring out some of these shadowy areas in my shot. Well, the first thing I do is I'm actually going to head down into my contrast, and I'm actually going to pull that down. And you'll see that by pulling that down, it's actually revealing some of those darker tones in my photo. And I'm actually doing this so that I can pull back on the contrast so that I don't actually have to pull up on the exposure as much. Because you'll see that when I pull up on the exposure here, it's bringing in light into the windows. And it's not bringing in a ton, it's just bringing in a little bit. And that's because we shot this photo so underexposed. This is allowing us to play with all of these shadow tones without actually blowing out these windows. So now let's go and let's just pull up on the exposure just a little bit more. That looks pretty good, like right there. And that's only by using two different sliders. So we've used our contrast slider and our exposure slider here. So not a lot of time. We've, brought out the life in the shot, and we still have a few different sliders to go. So now I just want to pull up on the midtones, which is basically the gray in my shot. And you'll see that by pulling up on those midtones, I'm actually pulling up a lot in these window areas. That's because a lot of the midtones in my photo are within these colors in the windows. So we'll probably pull it up just a hair more. Maybe right there. Boom. And now what we need to do is we need to pull out our shadow tones. So now if I pull up my shadow tones here, there we go. You'll see it's really pulling out all of those darker areas in my photo without actually blowing out the window areas, which is what we want. So just to kind of recap that, a quick way to pull out a lot of the underexposed area in a photo is to remove some of the contrast. This will kind of give you a good idea of how dark your photo is, and then modify the exposure a little bit, whether you want to pull up on it a tad or pull down on it a tad, just to kind of set your overall tonality with those two. And then you can head down into your midtones and your shadows and pull those up incrementally to reveal all of those dark areas in your photo. So now I'm going to go down, and I don't really want to deal with any of these other sliders inside tone and color. For the rest of these, we can actually use local adjustments and effects and apply them selectively to our shot. So I'm just going to head down into my color area here, and you'll notice that this photo is a little bit warm. When we shot the photo, it wasn't quite as warm, so we need to actually cool this down a little bit. So I'm just going to head over to my temperature, and I'm going to cool it down a little bit. Maybe about right there. Perfect. So now let's go over, and let's actually head into our local adjustments tab here. Ooh, actually, no, let's do effects first. Let's do effects first. So I'm going to head into effects, and we'll add some different filters first. So the first filter I want to add onto this photo, I want to apply some detail, but I don't want the detail to be applied to the entire image. So we'll add a filter, and I'm going to add one of my favorites, this dynamic contrast. And you'll see that by putting this on our shot here, it brought in a lot of nice detail to the photo. Well, I'm actually going to pull up on the small and on the medium so that it's a little bit more intense. But I don't actually want that applied to the entire image. I don't want it to be applied to these windows because it'll bring more attention to the detail in these areas on the street and in the cars. So we want to avoid all of the detail in these windows and kind of make them seem like they're non-existent, which I know they are, but we want to dull them down, dim them down. We don't want them to be kind of the subject in our shot. So what we can do is we're going to go into our dynamic contrast filter here. I'm actually going to invert it, and I'm going to leave those sliders the way we had them with the 21 and the 35 for the medium. And I'm actually going to go down and I'm going to pull up on the shadows a little bit. And I'm actually going to pull up on the blacks. And I'm going to add a little bit of highlight. So now let's grab our our masking brush here. I'm going to set it to paint in, holding down Shift and hitting X on my keyboard. Now I'm going to increase the brush size with the bracket keys on my keyboard. And I'm actually just going to paint in on these subject areas in my frame. Ooh, let's avoid that fireplace, it's pretty dark. Okay, so now if we turn this off and on, see how much that adds into the photo and really kind of brings in some detail and just a little bit of a shadow boost into these areas that we wanted to pop. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to modify this photo to kind of correct for the color. And one of my favorite ways to do that is by using a split tone filter. So let's go in, we'll add a filter, and we'll just add a split tone filter. And the reason I like adding split tone filters is because it allows me to modify the shadow colors and the highlight colors. So for example, inside the split tone filter, we have our highlights color chosen here, and we have our shadows color chosen here. Well, I'm going to go down and I'm actually going to use this cool one so that I have my highlights kind of this cream green color, and then my shadows are a darker blue. Notice how if I turn this off and on, it does a good job of correcting for the color. But it brings in a little bit of a haze onto my photo because my mode down here is set to normal. Let's go down and let's just use color. So now it's only being applied to the color in the shot and not being applied to the entire photo. So now if I turn this off and on, see how great of a job that does of removing all of those orange areas in my walls and leaving this photo basically how we shot it. Okay, so now that we've applied some detail and we've applied our color correcting split tone, let's go in and let's deal with these windows a bit. So let's go and I'm going to add a local adjustment layer. I'm going to make sure it's set to darken. I'm going to increase the temperature just a hair. And I'm actually going to pull back on the haze. And now before I paint this on, I'm going to let you guys know that it's going to be pretty strong. And most of the time when I'm painting on local adjustments or effects, I tend to paint them on 100% just so that I can see what they do to my shot. You can always go back and you can adjust the opacity for your adjustment. You can adjust the opacity for your brush. So there's a lot of different things that you can do to actually clean up and make it more natural. But at first, it's pretty easy to see what you're doing if everything's at 100%. So let's brush this on our windows here. And it might need a little less temperature, but it's still doing a good job of removing the haze from the windows. Yeah, we definitely need to remove that temperature. The windows weren't as blue as I had expected. Oops, pretty big one there. Okay, so now let's go back, let's remove that temperature. Ooh, so maybe like 2. Let's just type in 2. Boom, that looks about perfect, huh? Okay, so now let's just lower the opacity quite a bit. And then incrementally pull up on it. Okay, so now if we turn this off and on, see how well that does at kind of removing some of that haze from the glass and making it seem like it was a natural transition from the window. So this is a great way, using your local adjustments, to kind of remove some of those blown out areas in your windows, especially if it's a bright day. If it's a really bright day, you're gonna probably have a tough time shooting raw and getting all of these blown out areas in your window. For that, I would probably recommend shooting in HDR, which we're gonna talk about later on in this webinar. But using these local adjustments, set to darken, and then using your haze slider, does a really good job of kind of using, it almost makes it like a polarizer, where it removes the glare from your window. So just a tip, if you do have blown out windows and you want to use a local adjustment layer to remove them, use your darken and then pull back on your haze. And then remember that whatever temperature you're shooting at on your camera, if you do go in and you darken it, it's gonna heat it up a little bit. So remember that you've gotta play with your temperature slider over here to make it look more natural. So now let's hit the # key on our keyboard to see our original photo. And voila. Let's actually add one more filter here. Let's go in, and I tend to add these onto, I call them gallery shots, but basically shots of a room that are the highlight of it. So for example, this shot is probably a gallery shot of this photo, just because it's not at an angle and it's showing all of the different spaces in this photo. I would recommend using this photo for, like a banner or something on a real estate page, because it gives you an idea of what the room is like. So for these types of photos, I like to add a filter, and I like to go in and I'll add a vignette, and I'll tend to pick Big Softy, and then I lower the opacity quite a bit. But if I turn this off and on, maybe a little bit more. There we go. So now if we hit the # key on our keyboard, so really good job of kind of evening out these tones in the photo, removing the glare from the windows, and keeping everything, well exposed. Are there any questions before I move on to the next photo? I know that was pretty quick, but real estate doesn't take too much to modify, especially if you're shooting a good shot. Okay, so now let's do these photos here. And this is kind of a sad little story behind these photos, but a month ago, Bridgeport Brewing, one of the oldest brew pubs in Portland, shut down. So I had the opportunity about 3 or 4 months ago to go in and shoot photos for a lighting group in there. And so it just seems kind of fitting that we modify these photos to kind of commemorate Bridgeport Brewing, RIP. So let's go in, and I have these 3 auto exposure brackets of a photo, and I'm actually gonna merge them into HDR. And the reason I'm merging them into HDR is because when I shot this photo, it was pretty bright outside, and so the windows are a little bit more blown out than I'd like. So I'm using HDR to kind of even those tones out. So let's go in, and I'm just gonna click HDR. Okay, so now we have our HDR photo. And if you aren't familiar with HDR, you're basically gonna have this HDR dialog with a preview of your photo. Then below that, you're gonna have those auto exposure brackets that you merge together. Well, down here, you can actually choose which photo you want as your base exposure. So I'm actually gonna choose this photo here. And to switch your base exposure, you're basically gonna change this aperture icon and put it on any of these other photos. So I'm actually gonna use this one. And you'll see that it darkened up the photo a little bit. Well, that brought in a little bit more detail from these highlights in the window. So this seems pretty good right here. I don't want to modify these auto exposure brackets anymore, but now I want to modify our tone and color and set sort of a basic look for our shot. Let's go in here, and I'm going to actually choose a different camera profile. I'm going to choose ON1 neutral again, just so that I have that sort of flat blank canvas to work with. There's not a lot of contrast. There's not a lot of blown out colors. It's just sort of a flat neutral image. Makes it easy when you're modifying it in Photo Raw. Okay, so now what I want to do is I want to go in and I want to bring out some of the colors in the shot, bring out some of the tones, because it seems kind of flat and just a little warm and crunchy. So let's go in and let's remove the contrast a little bit. And I'm actually going to pull back on the exposure. Maybe about right So now let's go in and we'll pull up on the midtones, shadows. We'll actually go in and we'll add or pull up on the blacks just a hair. Okay. Now what we need to do is we obviously need to fix the temperature of the shot. Well, the great thing about shooting in RAW is that you can always go back and you can modify the temperature, and it will change the temperature throughout your photo, with all of the RAW data. Whereas if you have a JPEG, you can change the temperature, but it's not going to give you the same result. So in my color here, I'm just going to go down and I'm going to choose fluorescent because I was shooting it in a building with fluorescent lights. Well, it's still a little bit magenta purple to me. So I'm actually going to go over and I'm going to pull over on the temperature a little bit to cool it down a little bit more. And I'm actually going to pull down on the saturation quite a bit till it's a little bit more realistic. Maybe about 25. Cool. So now let's go down and I'm actually going to make sure that I'm opening my photo up inside of effects. And now I'm just going to click save. Oh, wait, sorry guys. So the HDR look. The reason I didn't talk about the HDR look is because I'm just leaving my HDR look at natural. So I'm just leaving it at that. But if you do want to go in and modify your HDR look, it lives up here right next to your tone and color. And so you can go in and you can modify your HDR look. I'm just going to leave mine at natural. I like how that looks. So let's click save. And it might take a second because these are pretty large raw files. But once it merges them together, it'll merge them together into an HDR photo. And it'll open up inside effects for us so we can start modifying it and adding different filters and really kind of making this photo come to life. Also, if you do have any questions, feel free to hit up that Q&A module. I know we're kind of cruising along here. Just another couple minutes when this loads. This is kind of the downfall of shooting RAW though. If you are shooting RAW files, especially if they're huge, it does take a minute for the software to kind of render them and play with them. But on the bright side, you get all of that raw data that you can modify a lot easier than you can do with a JPEG. And I'm not saying JPEG's bad. You can shoot JPEG all day. But if you really want to have the power to play with those tones in the photo, I would recommend shooting in RAW. Okay, awesome. So now we have our photo here, and that looks a lot better than it did with the single exposures. So now what we can do is we can start modifying this photo and applying different filters and making it look great. Okay, so the first thing I want to do instead of applying filters is I'm actually going to fix some of the areas in the shot that need to be kind of toned down. And by toned down, basically just remove some of the light. So let's go and we'll add a couple local adjustment layers here. And the first local adjustment layer, I want to make sure it's set to darken. And I'm actually going to head up and I'm going to grab my local adjustment gradient. And I'm just going to drop this down kind of right in the middle of the frame. And the reason I'm doing that is because I want to darken this area up top from my photo. Because we shot it in HDR, and there's actually a lot of kind of details in the ceiling, it's revealing all of those details and all of the shadow details in that ceiling, and it's kind of distracting to the photo. So we're just going to use this local adjustment layer to bring this up. And if we turn this off and on, it does a good job of kind of removing this area from our photo as such a relevant subject. Okay, so I have a question from Ron, said what lens? So it is a Sony 16-35 2.8 G Master. And I'll just type that in real quick. Awesome. Thanks, Ron, for the question. Okay, so back to the editing. So now that we've kind of toned down this top area in our shot, we want to tone down some of these light areas, in the windows, and then just a little bit of the areas on these seats because they're pretty strong. So what I want to do is I'm going to add a new local adjustment layer, set it to darken. Again, remove some of that haze. And then pull up on the temperature to about 1 or 2 or 3. Then we'll do the same thing we did earlier. We'll grab our adjustment brush and we'll just brush this on the windows. See how well that does at removing the glare on the windows just by using the haze. And like I said, you don't have to be too exact with this stuff. I mean, obviously you're going to probably brush over if you're using a masking brush. But as long as you make it look decent, I promise you the realtor will not notice. Let's actually just add a little bit more haze. Boom. So now let's pull this down and pull it up. Okay, and now if we turn this off and on, it does a really good job of removing a lot of that haze from those windows. It actually looks just like it did when I was standing in there shooting it. So again, local adjustments are an awesome way to remove a lot of that glare from your windows and just remove some of the light from them too, because 100% of the time when you're shooting an interior and there's windows, there's gonna be the battle between, do I shoot for the shadows in the shot or do I expose for the highlights? So one trick would be to simply expose for the shadows, or expose for the highlights rather. Shoot a little underexposed, go in, and then you can pull up on those shadow tones, midtones, and kind of reveal those darker areas in your shot. Last thing I want to do this photo before I head in and add some filters is I just want to crop. So I'm just going to pull this in and put this over there. Maybe a little bigger. So what I'm trying to do here with this crop is I'm actually trying to line this line up with this window and then have this line up over here so that it's nice and tightly framed. One thing about when you're shooting real estate is you want to have interesting framing and interesting composition. And it's hard if you're shooting interiors or a room because there's so many lines to choose from. Well, what I would recommend doing is just pick a line, whether it's a window or a cabinet or whatever it may be, and use it as your frame. So now I'm using this sort of line as my frame over here, and it's working well with this beam, and then I have this window as my frame on this side, and it's working well because there's not a lot of distractions in this area. So now if I hit enter, it brings in, or it tightens up the frame a little bit, it removes that TV, and it removes this area, and it just looks a lot better. So that's a good tip when you're cropping for real estate, is to think about your composition and think about your framing. Anytime you can incorporate lines into your photo where there's lines moving around and over to here, try to not remove those ones. Try to stick with just your outside areas to make sure that you have everything in frame. Okay, so I have a question from William Arthur. Says, what lens typically used, and if a wide angle, do you adjust for vertical alignment? Yes, so I use a Sony 16 to 35 millimeter whenever I'm shooting interiors. And one of my favorite things to use if I'm correcting for vertical alignment is just to head down to my develop. I'll head down into transform. And now you have all of these different options that you can use to either level, you can make it vertical, whatever you want to do. So if, say I shot my photo and it was tilted back a little bit, if I wanted to make that vertical, I could pull up on this and you'll see that it'll pull it up and make it more vertical. But I would recommend trying to get your photo as straight as possible in frame. I would also recommend having a bubble level on top of your camera if you are really concerned about getting it straight, because it does help a ton with getting your levels straight and getting your verticals straight on your shot. Okay, so Mike asked, in ON1, how do you correct for lens distortion? So all of your lens distortion is going to be in this lens correction area. And what I've done is I've actually just created a preset style for my 16 to 35 lens. So I can just go in here and I can do this. Oops. Sorry. And I don't think it's letting me account for lens correction in this photo because it's an HDR photo and there's 3 different exposures. So I'll just use my Sony the 16 and we'll leave it at that. So real quick, let me just finish this photo and then I'll get to some more of those questions. Okay, so a couple more filters just to kind of go over them again with you guys. We'll add another filter and we're gonna add again the split tone filter because it does such a good job of removing warm tints from your shot. I'm gonna use cool again and I'm gonna go down and I'm gonna click color, normal. And for this particular photo, since we did remove a lot of that heat from our photo earlier, we probably don't need this as strong. So let's go in and we'll just pull back on the opacity a little bit. Now what we're gonna do is we're gonna add a filter. And we're actually gonna add a sunshine filter. And the reason I'm adding a sunshine filter is because the sunshine filter essentially darkens the darker areas and it brightens the highlights. And so when you're shooting real estate and you're shooting HDR, because all of the areas are well exposed and all of the areas that are dark you can see, it kind of looks flat sometimes or it looks crunchy and unnatural. So what you can do to kind of combat that is you can add a sunshine filter. So notice how I added this filter, and if I turn this off and on, see how it makes everything look less flat? Well, that's because it's kind of bringing in a sunshine look into your shot. Another great way to fix for a flat photo is to add a curves filter. So we'll add a filter and we'll just add curves. And the reason I like adding curves is because it allows me to bring out all of the different tonalities in my photo. So if I'm wanting to modify the shadows, I can go down and I have all of this play with the shadow tones in my shot. Or if I want to modify the midtones, I can play with the midtones in here, or highlights or blacks. Whatever it may be, this tone curve is going to allow me to modify all of those tones. And the great thing about the tone curve inside Photo Raw is that you can actually mask and blend it out from certain areas you don't want it to be applied to. So let's go and we'll just reset this. And one of my favorite ways to bring in a little bit of oomph to a photo is to go over to your curves, grab your shadows, pull them down a tad, then go up a little bit, grab this area, and then pull it up. So now if I turn this off and on, see how that added in some nice detail and it brought in a little more contrast to my photo? And then I can always pull up on the midtones here. Pull this over. So if you are looking to make your photo a little less flat, I would recommend having the sunshine filter or using your tone curve. For now, we'll just stick with the sunshine filter. Okay, so another couple filters to add onto this photo here. We're gonna add a filter, and we're just gonna add dynamic contrast again. And we're gonna make it really natural. And we're actually gonna remove the large because we only want the middle. I'll turn that up. And I'm just gonna brush this in kind of right in this area where the chairs are. Let's move it up maybe a little more small. There we go. And then let's just pull up on the shadows a little bit. Boom. So now if I turn this off and on, see that crisped up these areas in here, brought some detail, and also allowed us to pull out some of those shadow tones. So it's just kind of a good reminder that even though these filters do apply a lot of cool style, you have the ability to go in and really modify each of these filters to your liking. So if there isn't something that if there is something in this filter that you're confused about, I would recommend just playing with the slider and see what it does onto your shot. And then just to finish this photo off, we'll just add one of my favorite things. We'll add a vignette, big softy, and then just lower the opacity. And so now if we hit the backslash key on our keyboard, done a really good job of kind of just pulling out those shadow tones, removing the glare from the windows, and then pulling in some detail to our subject area here. Okay, so a couple more questions here. Question from Ron asking about Canon 14 2.8. Great glass. Really awesome glass. It is really wide though. Are you shooting on a crop sensor? If you are shooting on a crop sensor, I would recommend shooting with maybe a 10 to 18 Canon. And I also wouldn't say to think about the aperture as much, just because when you are shooting real estate, you probably want it to be at least like an 8 aperture or an 11, just so a lot of things are. Oh, 5D Mark III. That's the camera I used to have. So you have a Canon 14 on 2.8 on a 5D Mark III. I'm sure that's a great setup. It is a little wide though, I'm assuming, because it is 14. But no, because you are shooting with 5D Mark III, you could shoot RAW, shoot 14, and then if you need to crop, you could just go in and crop those RAW files. And also, I didn't use a flash for these photos. I have used a flash before, but not on these particular images. So I hope that helps, Ron. I would definitely, that's a solid glass right there, Canon 14 2.8. It just might be a little bit wide, and you might not have that range of zooming in because it is a prime. But then again, you can always crop. So. Okay, so I have a question from Richard. And it says, in Matt K's recent video, he said he uses modules and effects instead of using local adjustments. What are your thoughts? Is he talking about applying different styles to different areas on your photo, or just applying maybe like a tone enhancer instead of effects? Because if you are applying specific adjustments to specific areas on a photo, I would definitely recommend using your local adjustments, because they're going to use all of the raw data in your image. And so if you are shooting raw, definitely if you want to modify specific areas, go to your local adjustments. Your local adjustments are going to be your saving grace for modifying specific areas in your shot, especially if you shoot raw. But if you are applying like a stylistic look or something, definitely go into effects, and then you can use these different filters. I hope that answered your question. I'm not really sure what the video you're talking about was on, but awesome, guys. Thanks for the questions. Keep them coming, and sorry for those of you that didn't ask a question. I'm just answering these, but I wanted to get them answered. So, okay, let's get out of this shot here, and let's go into this photo. Okay, so this photo. The great thing about this photo is that it's going to be super easy to go in and make it interesting. That's why I love shooting architecture and real estate, is because your subjects don't move, they're easy to photograph, and their edges are really hard around the building, so it's really easy to replace the sky. So for this particular photo, I want to go in and I just want to add a more interesting sky to it. So let's go in and we'll do that. The first thing I want to do this photo is I want to crop it. So I'm going to hit C on my keyboard, and I just want to crop to get this snow out of my photo and this arrow. So I'm actually just going to pull up on the bottom here. Oops. Just like that. And now I'm actually going to level this a little bit. So we'll just drag this on a horizon line. Boom. So now let's hit enter. And we have our cropped image. Okay. So now we need to go in and we need to pull out some of the detail in this photo here, just to make it look a little bit more like it's been edited. So I'm just going to go inside my tone and color here, and I'm going to choose my camera profile. And again, I'm going to choose ON1 neutral. So now let's go in, and I'm actually just going to pull back on the contrast a little bit, pull up on the midtones of hair, and I'm actually going to go down and I'm going to increase the temperature a little bit. Just like that. So nothing crazy, just kind of pulling out the tones in the shot, just so that when we do add a sky layer, it doesn't look like they're completely different exposures and styles. So let's go and we'll add a new layer here. Go in extras, ON1 extras, go into backgrounds. And let's grab, I'll grab this one. Okay, so now I'm just gonna drag this up, make it huge, and then pull it down. Let's lower the opacity a little bit so we can see it. Okay, that looks pretty good. Turn up the opacity to 100. Now we're gonna drag this sky layer below our base layer. We're gonna make sure we have our base layer selected. And now we're gonna mask out the background. So let's go over to our masking tools. And we're gonna grab our AI Quick Mask tool. And the AI Quick Mask tool is great if you're shooting architecture outside and you want to replace the sky. Especially because it does a great job of detecting different tints and tonality. So if you do have a sky that's a lot different than your building, which more often than not it's going to be, this tool saves you a lot of time when you're trying to mask out a large tonal area. So when you first grab the AI Quick Mask tool, your mode's going to be set to drop. So basically you're going to tell PhotoRob what areas in your shot that you don't want to be there. Well, I don't want these skies, or the sky area in my shot, so I'll just brush this on. And now what I want to do is I'm going to go up to my mode and I'm going to select keep. Now I'm just going to brush this on. And then we'll just hit apply. And I kind of had to play with this earlier a little bit, so we'll see how good this mask does for this one. Well, voila. Pretty darn good job right there, I would say. There's a few areas of red in here that we can fix, but that'll be easy. So we'll just paint this on the areas of pink that we don't want to be there. Oops. And then we'll just brush this on here. And then maybe here and see how that does. And then we'll click apply. Awesome. That does a pretty good job. We can clean this up later. So let's go in here and let's click done. So now it's just going to refine the mask and remove that sky area from the shot. And then we can go in and we can start modifying the photo, applying different filters to it. Boom. Did a pretty good job of doing it right away. Okay, so there's a couple areas we need to clean up in here. The first area is up here on the top of our building. So we'll click Z for our zoom tool, and let's just move into that area real quick. And I'm going to clean this up with my perfect brush. So I'm going to hit B on my keyboard. I'm going to go up and I'm going to make sure it's set to 100%, and then I turn my perfect brush on. So now I'm going to make sure I'm set to paint in, Shift X on my keyboard to switch, and now I'll just brush this building back on using my perfect brush. And don't worry if if it's not getting it 100%, you can always zoom out and you're not going to tell. So just get it as best as you can, and no one will know the difference. So now we'll zoom over here. Fix this railing here. What happened to that? Boom. Okay, so that kind of got janky right there. So let's go in and let's actually paint that back in. Oops. You know what, let's refine that. So let's zoom out real quick here. Yeah, it looks kind of janky over there. So let's just go in and I'm actually going to click refine. And we'll just brush this back in. It's not doing much. You know what, we'll just do this. Grab our perfect brush, make sure it's set to paint out, and we'll just brush this blue stuff out of here. Okay, so now I'll go up and I'll make sure I'm set to paint in, or my perfect brush is off. And now I can just brush in these little areas that I messed up. There we go. So we got a little bit of area in here to clean up. So let's grab our brush again. We'll just set it to paint out. Hopefully, there we go. Okay. Whoops, gotta make sure I'm on the right layer. Sorry guys, it's kind of a tedious thing when you gotta replace skies if it doesn't work out the first time, but. Okay, that's probably pretty good. You can't even really tell the difference. Okay, so now what I wanna do is I just want to make a nice brush stroke right across this area here. So I'm just going to hit B on my keyboard to grab my masking brush. I'm going to turn off my perfect brush and I'm going to lower the opacity to about 15. Now I'm going to make my brush size really big. And I'm just going to brush on this bottom area. There we go, to kind of blend it. There we go. So now it looks a lot more natural like that. Oops. Okay, so now what we need to do is we need to actually stamp these two layers together so that we have one layer that we can modify as a whole. Well, first off, I'm actually gonna go in and I'm gonna pull down on the opacity or the exposure for this base layer here so that it's a little bit darker, so that it's not so bright from the sky. So now let's go, and if I want to merge these two layers together and create a complete composite layer that I can modify as a whole, I'll just right click, new stamped layer, and it's going to take these two layers, duplicate them, and then merge them together into one layer that I can modify separately. So now we can go in and we can start applying different filters and effects to this photo. So let's go in and I'm actually going to pull up on the contrast a little bit, pull up on the midtones a hair, shadows, and I'm actually going to increase the temperature just a little bit. So now let's go in, we'll go into effects, and let's add some detail. So I'm just going to add a filter, and I'll add dynamic contrast. But I don't want that to be applied to the sky area, I only want it to be applied to the building. So I'll invert this, and now I'll just brush this on onto my building. And we'll pull up on the small a little bit because there is a lot of small contrast. So now if I turn this off and on, does an awesome job of bringing out that detail in the shot. So let's add another couple filters here. I'm going to add sunshine. I'm actually going to pull back on the opacity a little bit. Let's add another filter, split tone, warm, color. And now let's add 2 more filters. And the reason I want to add these 2 is because I want to add a vignette because I want the viewer's eyes to go into the center of the frame. So the vignette's going to cover that. But now we want to add one last filter, and it's just to kind of stylize the shot a little bit. So I'm going to add a LUTs. I know that not everybody uses LUTs, but they do bring in a ton of style to your shot, and they're really easy to use. And I always go to the simple warm, and then I just take this opacity, and I pull it all the way back, and then I just pull it up incrementally. And now watch as I turn this off and on. Brings in a little bit of style, a little bit of boost to the photo, and kind of takes down the color a little bit. So now we have this sky replaced pretty well. Let's add another filter, and I'm actually going to add a borders filter, and we'll just fit this image in here. Oops. Perfect. Now let's add a little bit of text. Let's type in Vista House. We can drag this down here. And there you go. You have a nice little postcard that you made by just replacing a sky and taking a photo of some architecture. So I'm actually going to remove this border, and I'm actually going to remove this text just so I can show you guys the before and after. So now if we reset this bottom layer, so this is our base layer that we were working with before. So a good way, if you are modifying layers and using them to composite images and replace a sky, if you want to see a good before and after, go to that base layer that you had that you replaced the sky from, reset those layer properties. That's going to reset the mask so that your sky layer isn't replaced in that photo. So now if I turn this photo off and on, it's going to show me my original shot. So you'll see in not a lot of time, really kind of elevated this photo, replaced the sky, brought in some detail, and stylized it. So that's one great thing about shooting architecture is most of the time buildings are going to be pretty easy to mask out so that you can go in and you can kind of get creative by adding some different components to it, whether it be a sky, birds, or applying different filters. Okay, so any more questions here? I have a question from Richard. Oh, okay, so instead of using local to reduce exposure, he would use tone enhancer with an inverted mask and then paste it in the adjustment. You could use that. I mean, I guess it kind of depends on what you're doing. So for example, if I added, let's go back to those other photos. Oh, I don't want to save that. Okay, so this will be a good example. Okay, so Richard, 2 questions. So let me get on your local adjustments one, and then I'll move to that other one, Rich. Okay, so Richard's asking basically why not create the masks in effects, and then you can bring them into local adjustments and paste them. So yeah, you can always do that. So if you do have an effect on here, if you add a filter, say we add dynamic contrast, and we apply it to these stools here. And now let's say we want to use the same mask to apply settings in local adjustments. Well, what we can do is we can head into our masking options here, and we can just copy that mask. And now let's say, hey, we want to apply a local adjustment with that same mask. I can go into local adjustments and that layer, and I can paste that. And now I can play with those adjustments to pull out tonalities or whatever I need to do to this shot. And then you can keep applying that mask onto any of those other photos or any of those other filters. Okay, so I hope that kind of answers your question, Richard. I guess it just kind of depends on what you're trying to do with your photo. If you are, using a tone enhancer filter inside of effects to bring out some of the shadows and stuff, that's fine. It just kind of depends on what you're trying to mask in and out, on whether you would copy the mask and paste it into local adjustments or create the mask in local adjustments and paste it into effects, if that makes sense. And then your other question was, can you explain why you reduced the contrast in develop? So the reason I reduced the contrast instead of develop is because it reveals a lot of the darker tones in the shot. Sorry, what do I have? Oh, local adjustments. Okay, so for example, for this photo, it's a little bit underexposed, right? There's not a lot of light in the shot. And so if I wanted to pull out some of the darker shadow tones in my shot without actually having to pull up on the exposure slider a bunch, I would just go over into my contrast and I could pull back on it. And you see how that's revealing a lot of those darker tones in my photo? So now if I pull up on the contrast, I'm bringing in darker tones. So by removing some of that contrast, you're removing contrast so it's a little bit flat, but you're also pulling out shadow tones without actually using your shadow slider or your exposure. So that when you do need to use the exposure slider, you don't have to pull up on it as much. And then if you want to add contrast, you could pull down on your midtones, you could pull down on your blacks, or you could go in and that's where you could use that tone enhancer to add some contrast. So I hope that helped. All right, guys, well, that's kind of the end of the interiors and architecture webinar. Okay, so Ron asks, I have fits with brown color consistency. If you're having problems with color, a lot of the times when you are shooting interiors, there's going to be problems with especially woods or walls. I would recommend using split tone filters. Split tone filters really help because they allow you to specifically target your highlights or your shadows. Or you could go in and, for example, this photo, we'll go back here real quick. So for example, we'll just use this shot. So it's pretty brown, right? There's a lot of oranges and stuff in here. You could go in, you could add an effect, and you could add a color adjustment, and then you could target those reds, oranges, and yellows, and you could just modify the saturation. Oops, whoops. Or you could modify the hue a little bit to make it more yellow or more red. And you'll see that there's not a lot more brown tones in here. And then we can always go back and we can modify that a little bit more. Okay, so yeah, that's some ways that you can fix color. Again, I would recommend using split tone filter if you are having trouble with colors in your photo, but color adjustment works also. I know a lot of the time when I'm shooting hardwood floors, they get really yellow and gross, and so I can go in and I can, remove those specific colors using my color adjustment. All right, guys, well, thanks so much. I really appreciate all the questions and you guys sticking around the whole time, so stay tuned for more webinars, and have a great weekend. Thanks, guys.